Hello guys, this is Sean Hoot here and welcome to another episode of No Code with Sean Hoot. In this tutorial, we are going to look at how we can configure Stripe webhooks for our Bubble backend. Before we start, let's look at what webhooks are for those that are not familiar with the concept of webhooks. So webhooks are basically a way for your application to be notified by other third-party applications or services when some event occurs at the third party's end. So in our current use case, we want Stripe to notify us whenever some event occurs in our Stripe account. Okay. Now, when do you use webhooks? You use webhooks for behind-the-scene transactions. So for payment services like Stripe, there are so many things that can occur in your Stripe account that are not due to explicit action from your application. For example, if your application has a payment subscription and for a particular month, you couldn't charge, Stripe couldn't charge your user's credit card. You want Stripe to notify you that, okay, payment for this particular customer failed, so that you can take an action, such as maybe emailing the customer to tell the customer that we couldn't charge your credit card, so update your credit card, etc. Or maybe a customer decided to request for a refund, so you decided to refund the money to your customer. You want Stripe to notify your application when the refund goes through. Okay, so this is basically the idea behind webhooks. So there are two sides to a webhook. You're going to have an endpoint at your back end that will be listening for the events from the webhooks from your third-party service. So in this particular case, we are going to define the webhooks in Stripe, and Stripe will be sending some events, or will be making some calls to an API endpoint in our backend. Okay, so now let's look at the first step in this tutorial, that is creating the API endpoint in our backend, and in this case Bubble. Okay, so just log into your Bubble account and come to the settings page. Then in the settings page, go to API, and then make sure that you've checked this app exposes API workflow. So once you click this and then you click on the pages, you realize a new page, API workflows, appears here. If you don't check this, you're not going to see that API page, right? So now I check it, and then we have this API workflows. So then you click on API workflows. So we are ready to define our API endpoint that Stripe will be sending the responses or the request to, actually. So now click here, and then under general, click on new API endpoint, and then just provide your endpoint any name. I will just call this one Stripe charge endpoint. Okay. Then the next step, make sure that exposed as a public endpoint is checked, and then this endpoint can be run without authentication. This is because Stripe is going to be making the request, and Stripe will not be authenticating to your app. So make sure you've checked this box. Okay. Then the next thing that we need to do is to define the parameters. Okay. Now doing this manually is really tedious because Stripe is going to send a whole lot of data to us, and we might not even know all the different fields that Stripe is going to send us. So going through this and adding them manually is going to be too cumbersome, right? And error prone. So what we will do is that we will let Bubble help us do this. To do that, just click on the manual definition and click on detect request data. So what we are going to do is that we are going to let Bubble help us actually define the structure for the parameters for this particular endpoint. So we will just click on this detect data, and Bubble creates some kind of an initializing endpoint for us. So what Bubble is doing is that it has created some endpoint internally, and it will allow us to send a test data to that particular endpoint, and then Bubble automatically detects all the parameters and use it to initialize our endpoint for us. So we will just copy this, click on it to copy this endpoint, and this is what we are going to enter into our Stripe webhook as our endpoint. Okay, so this does it for this first step and then this second step. Very simple. So now we are on the third step where we are going to Stripe to set up the webhook. Okay, so now go to your Stripe account, log into stripe.com, then go to developers, then webhooks. Now we don't have any webhook defined here, so click on add endpoint, and then under the URL just paste the endpoint that you copied from Bubble. Make sure that it has this initialized, because we are just going to initialize the endpoint. Okay, now under the filter event, Stripe actually sends several different kinds of event types. So you might want to maybe restrict the type of events that you want Stripe to send you. Or if you wanted to send all the different types of events, you can just select this one. But I will advise that you choose this select types of events. And the reason is that the events that Stripe are going to send, there are different kinds of objects. If you look here, you realize this one accounts, this one also has to do with account, this one has to do with account. If you scroll down, you start seeing charges, right? So when Stripe is sending these events, it also sends some objects along with it. And since all the objects are different, it is better to create separate endpoints for each object, because the object fields are going to be different. Okay, so like for example, a charge object has different fields to an account object. So what we are going to do is we are going to send all the charge events actually to the endpoint that you've created. So I will select this charge captured, just select all of them. So charge refunded, charge succeeded. So anytime any of these events occurs, Stripe is going to notify our backend, and then we can take an action. Okay, so if there's a dispute, there's a refund, and there's a charge, and etc. Okay, so now click on add endpoint. So now we've successfully created an endpoint. Now again, look at the name here. We have the endpoint name that we gave, and then the one that Stripe added for us, the initialize. You'll later come back to change this after we've finished the initialization. Okay. Now, if we were to go back to Stripe, you realize Stripe is still waiting for us to send us some data so that it can initialize it for us. Okay, so let's go back and then click on the endpoints, then click on send test webhook. So now Stripe is saying, okay, which event type should I send to your endpoint? Now you can choose any of them. So for this one, let's say charge captured. Let's just select the first one and then send test webhook. Okay, so now Stripe is saying that it sends this request. You see, there's a huge amount of data. That is why I said it's going to be difficult to actually do this manually in Bubble. So we are using the automatic approach of detecting the request. Now, if you look down at the response, it starts with success. And then the message, the endpoint, Stripe charge endpoint that we created was successfully initialized. So this is message that Bubble sent to Stripe when Stripe sent it this request. So now we are done. We can cancel here, and let's go back to Bubble and see. So once we come to Bubble, you realize that Bubble was able to detect the data. Do you get it? If you scroll down here and you click on show raw data, you will see the request that Stripe sent to Bubble. Now, if you look at all the information here and you were to go back into Stripe, and let's look at this, the test data that it sent. Okay. let's see. Okay, this is not the test. I'm trying to find the test data. Anyway, let's just go ahead. Okay, so once Bubble has detected this, okay, now there are times that Bubble actually try to guess the type based on the value that was sent. So for example, here it saw this number, so it said, okay, the type is a number. It saw false, so it said the type is a yes or no field, that is a Boolean field. It saw this, it says, okay, it is a text. Now there are times that Bubble's detection or Bubble's guessing is not correct, especially if you look at this value they created. It's supposed to be a Unix timestamp, which is the number of seconds that has passed since 1971st January, right? But because Bubble saw a number, it says it's a number, but in fact this should be a date, so you can change it to a date. So you can go through this, and if you think Bubble detected something wrongly, you can modify it. Once you are done, you just click on save. So doing this, we have actually automatically detected all the parameters, and we've initialized our endpoint. So we are going to go back to our Stripe dashboard and then modify it to remove the initialize that Stripe added at the end, because this was just added by Bubble so that it could initialize it. And then update Webhook. Okay, so now we have just our endpoint name here. So if you come back here, this is the same name that we have here. This one is supposed to be the same name as this. Okay, so we've actually finished setting up the webhook here. There's nothing to actually do here again. So let's go back to our to-do list. So we've done this step, and the next step is to define the endpoint workflows. Okay, so now that we've defined our endpoint, when Stripe receives a request from when Bubble receives a request from Stripe, we want to take some action. So what do we want to do? Okay, so maybe we want to create some records in our database. So what I did here is I created a table called payments, and I defined just these 3 fields. You can add several fields. And I have an amount field, I have a charge ID, and then I have event type. Anytime Stripe sends an event from a webhook, there's going to be an event type. Okay, so I create this table, and then what I'm going to do is, under the workflow, anytime we receive a request, I want to create a new record into that table. So I come to data things and then create a new thing. Then Bubble asks you what type of thing do you want to create? Payments. And then we have to define the fields. So the amount is going to be, now click here and then request data. The request data is actually the data that Bubble detected when we did the initialization. So once you click on request data, you're going to have access to all the data that Stripe sent us. Okay, so for the amount field, look for object amount. Then for the charge ID, again, request data, then look for object ID. Then the last one, event type, just look for type, request data, and then type. Okay, so what we've done here is that we are telling this endpoint, whenever you receive a request, create a new field in our database. Create a new record in our database in the table payments, and assign these values to the fields. Okay, so I created a page called payments page. It's a very simple table page. I'm not going to explain how to do this. It's very simple if you know Bubble, how to create a table just using repeating groups. And what this repeating groups is doing is just to search for all the payments and then just sort by the creation dates. Okay, so if you come to our preview, our table is empty because we haven't created any payments record in our database. So what we can do now is let's go to Stripe, and then let's try to actually send some event from Stripe, right? Okay, let's look at this payment here. Let me click on it, and let's decide that we want to refund this particular payment. So I'll click here, and then refund the reason requested by customer, and look at it, the amount is 25 Canadian dollars, and then refund. Okay, so the money has been refunded. So what we expect is that Stripe should contact our API workflow, that endpoint we define, and then create this new record in our database. So now let's look at our database and see whether the new record was created. So if you come to payments, you see the new record was created. And if you come to the table that we created, see we have it here. Now, this one is showing 2,500 because all amounts in Stripe are in cents, right? So for $1, it's going to send 100, which is 100 cents. So we can actually fix this. So let's go back to the workflows. Because Stripe is sending sent amount, what we want to do is that divide this amount by 100 so that we get a dollar value. Okay, and let's refresh. No, it's not going to affect this one because this one has already been recorded in the database. But when we do another one, it should work. Okay, so now let's go back and let's do another event. In fact, instead of just doing some explicit event from here, let's go to an application that we've created in DropSource. So DropSource is a framework that allows you to create native mobile apps without using any code. So I've created this simple app that allows us to charge a credit card. So I'll just run this in the simulator and then click here. Okay, so it is installing the app in the simulator, and then we will run it. So instead of using a real credit card number, I will go and use one of Stripe's testing cards. Let's use American Express, or let's use Discover. Okay, just Discover. Sorry, where is? And then let's just paste the number here. Then for the month, just enter any valid month. Then for the year, any valid year in the future. Then for the CVC, just any 3-digit number, and then pay. Okay, so the card number is incorrect. Oh, okay. Let's try a different number. Let's try this number. I don't know why it says the card number is incorrect. Sorry. Just delete this. Okay. Then let's try this again. Boom, worked. Okay, so payment successful. So if you look at this charge ID 1DT and ends in 9H, if you come to our Stripe dashboard, let's refresh payments. Let's refresh this page. Should reflect here. Okay, yes, that is it. 1DT. See this? It's reflected here. Okay, so now let's go to Bubble and see if Stripe actually notified our backend that some payment was made. Okay, so if you come here, you realize, see, it is here. The charge succeeded. Let's do this side by side and actually see this as it occurs. I'm just going to do them side by side. Let's do this. Okay, let's make another payment. This time I'm going to use this MasterCard. Okay, so it's to install the app. Paste the number here, a valid month, valid year, then digit number, then pay. Okay, so this payment was successful. You see, immediately the payment was successful. It appeared here. So our webhook is working perfectly. Okay, so before I end this tutorial, I just want to show you one more thing. So there's a lot that we could do here once we receive the event from our webhook. Currently, we just said that, okay, whenever we receive event from the webhook, we just create a new record in our database. Now, we could do something more interesting. For example, we could say that whenever we receive a refund event, we want to email the customer to tell them that their money has been refunded. Okay, so here we will just click on new action, email, send email. In a real scenario, you'll probably be getting the customer's email from the chat. I haven't set that up yet, so I'll just enter some static email here. Okay, then the subject is refund, and the sender name, let's say let's call it Sean. Now in the body, you say your refund for this Canadian amount. Then we go to request data, then amount refunded, right? So we are saying this. Now this value is going to be in cents, so let's convert it to a dollar value by dividing by 100. Okay, so your refund for this was successful. Now we want to execute. I need to have a space here. Sorry. Okay, you can format it any way that you want. So we want to only execute this particular action, that is sending the email, only when the event type is a refund. So it's a charge refund, charge.refunded. You can get all these event types from Stripe. Okay. So now what you've done is we've said if you receive an event from Stripe, create a new payment record in our database, then send an email to the customer here, just this customer, only when the event was a charge refund. So this will always execute because you don't have any condition, but this will only execute when the type of event was a refund. Okay, so now let's test this and see. I'm just going to go to Stripe. Let's just look for some payment and let's try to refund the payment. So there was this payment here for 75 Canadian. Let's refund it. Actually, let's say we are taking some commission, so we are not refunding the whole amount. So let's refund $72. Okay, and now click refund, and partial refund. It was successful, and you see our email too just came in. We click on it and said your refund for 72 Canadian dollars was successful. So as you can see, what you can do here is just up to you. You can do a whole lot of things here. I hope this is very clear, and if you have any questions, you can post it under the video or you can ask in the drop source forum. Thank you for listening and see you in the next tutorial. Bye.